All right, so welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Jeff Macher. I am the director for the Center for Business and Public Policy, which I'm going to describe in 1 minute, along with John Mayo, the executive director. We conduct issues and examine issues at the nexus of business and public policy. The mission of the center is to engage scholars, industry folks, and academics, and policymakers in relevant inquiries and dialogue related to issues at the nexus of business and public policy. So think anything that has an effect on business with a policy dimension or any policy dimension that affects business. This is something that we look at. Now what we do is host a variety of events, including conferences, Georgetown on the Hill events, where we actually take an academic to go down to Georgetown, go down to the Hill and present research, as well as business, economic, and public policy seminars, and this would be one of those venues. Our research is beyond sort of the meetings and seminars that we have, academic papers, and what we call economic policy vignettes. If those of you that are familiar with the Hill, you might call these leave behind. We are a number of scholars and affiliates. Our most important player is Andrea Salvatore, who just left the room. And then we have a number of senior policy scholars from both Georgetown and then inside and outside of the Beltway, a variety of different schools and universities and whatnot. We have visiting senior policy scholars that work in industry, as well as innovation and industry scholars, as you say, and then a variety of affiliates. All right, without taking too much of your time, I want to just lay out the issue. I was asked to say introductory remarks on this issue of immigration reform in the high-tech sector, so I'm going to do that now. All of my remarks are taken from a book I co-edited with my dissertation advisor, David Macher. He's a professor at UC Berkeley. So this was a book that looked about 20 years later at a book written by the National Academy of Sciences called U.S. Industry in 2000. And what it asked is, now that a lot of the globalization of industries have occurred in production and have been either offshored or outsourced, what has been the effect of innovation and R&D? The question that we sought to ask, there's three. What changes have occurred in the structure and globalization of innovation in specific industries, which I'll mention on the next slide? What effect have these changes had on U.S. firms and U.S. firm employment? And then lastly, how well are scholars and policymakers able to measure these changes? The third one's easy. It's not very much. It's pretty hard to measure these changes. Our approach were the studies of changes in 10 different manufacturing and service industries. And then the criteria that we used were they had to be high-tech or knowledge-intensive. And typically they were funded by the Sloan Foundation. Sloan left a lot of money to look at different industries. The 10 industries, 5 in the information technology sector, including flat panel displays, PCs, semiconductor software, solid-state lighting, biopharmaceuticals, both pharma and biotech. We also looked at the logistics industry and then some financial industries, financial services, and the extent of capital. Now, the changes that we saw since 2000, so this was an update, 2000 to 2008 were the following. A lot of innovative and productive capacity has left the United States. Not left, but it's actually been found outside of the U.S. And you see that in the size and sophistication of engineering and scientific workforces. So that's one thing that's potentially damning for U.S.-based firms. Another thing we see, though, is interregional shifts in scope and sophistication of customer demand. What used to be the most sophisticated customer groups in the United States has now shifted in many dimensions, where a lot of the Asian countries have very sophisticated users, which then can pull demand of innovation with them. Another thing we see, and certainly something in the semiconductor industry, is the growth of what's called vertical specialization. So instead of the industry being vertically integrated across value chain stages, there are these specialized firms that operate in one part of the value chain, the so-called pure play foundries that Mr. Tsui will probably talk about. Or two-tiered industry structures where there's a combined specialization in the industries, as well as some firms that are also vertically integrated. So for instance, Intel is vertically integrated in product design and process manufacturing. However, it faces competition from others that are in one stage of the value chain. So it's a two-tiered structure. And then many industries, there's a greater reliance on advanced information and communication technologies, and I know your background is well there. There's some minimal changes, however, that have occurred. Things, in other words, has not changed at all. One is the importance of R&D and innovative policy. So markets that are open to inflow of goods, technology, people, and capital is absolutely required for the continued success of a nation or even a firm. The other thing that's troubling, and this is mainly from an academic, which is what I am, there's just not a lot of good data out there. Look at these trends. It's limited, it's dated, it's imperfect, it's backward looking. You know, we're looking at, we can't use it prospectively as well as we want. So one issue might be employment trends and industry value chain activities. It's hard to measure. It's not that the industry went away. It's just that some parts of the value chain have shifted, and it's hard to disentangle the changes with the industry structure with the changes in employment levels. And then what is surprising is the homebound nature of inventive activity in several industries. Predominantly, if you look at invention and define that as patenting, it's largely homebound. It tends to be in the home country to this day, which is surprising. Well, there's also some issues that come out. What's required and what sort of what comes out of the 10 industry studies is some general R&D policy issues. First and foremost is if the U.S. is going to be competitive, it needs to support a robust R&D infrastructure. And that's some combination of public and private investment through university, industry, and government. That's UIG, university, industry, and government collaboration. So universities working with industries, which are then working with government for this to secure research funding. That importantly attracts both U.S. and non-U.S. firms. If it just attracts U.S. firms, the United States is at a disadvantage, and that's true of any country. Because the developed and developing countries are emulating exactly what the U.S. R&D policies are in terms of this U.S. industry and government policies. We obviously have to improve data collection. That's an issue for most of the academics. And then there's legitimate concerns and needs around what happens to economies as they shift. So for instance, as you hollow out manufacturing, what are the policy consequences of liberalization and globalization? And that's something it's a bigger picture. Now, now more narrowly to the issue that's going to be discussed here, immigration policy. I'm just going to only highlight two that we highlight, and actually really one that we highlight in the book. And one issue is H-1B visas, and I'm certain it's going to be discussed here, so I won't discuss it in any detail. There's an argument there's a shortage of high-tech workers. So we use H-1B visas and give them to foreigners with high-tech skills or in specialty occupations that are required and necessary. Now they're capped currently by the Immigration Services at 65,000, and there's substantial, let's just say they're substantially oversubscribed. Now, there are two arguments, however, to that, and I think any sort of discussion in an academic setting needs to address both sides. And on the first side is policies that cap H-1B visas are counterproductive to U.S. technological and economic competitiveness. If we don't open and raise the cap, more and more of the best engineers and scientists will leave this country for other countries. And again, the U.S. loses its competitiveness. But there's another argument that policies need to protect domestic workers, and firms should instead invest early on in talent at a very early age. Instead of hiring a PhD or a master's level engineer or scientist, hire them as bachelors without outsourcing those entry-level jobs. Have them continue through their careers with the particular company that they're in, and then let them flourish. All right? An engineer may not be an engineer regardless of the level's different, and that's really, I think, an argument that's justified. With that, that's pretty much it. So what I'm going to say, I want to leave you, if anything, I want to leave you with this. We're seeing substantial changes, and immigration policy is but one part of the overall policy picture for maintaining a robust R&D infrastructure, as this book attempted to talk about in the United States. All right, with that, Alidad is going to formally introduce our speakers. I get to take a back seat, but I'll certainly throw lobs and questions there if asked.